Greetings and welcome to another edition of The Pedal Shift Project. The Pedal Shift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/320, and you can email the show at pedalshift@pedalshift.net or text me at 202-930-1109 and check Pedal Shift out on all the socials as well. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 320th edition of the Pedal Shift Project. My name's Tim Mooney. Thanks so much for joining. On this edition, we're doing the takeaways for the Southern California adventure here in 2023. It's all in the rearview mirror now, and I definitely learned some things, as I always do with every single tour, that I thought I would share with you all. Then, after I'm done wrapping up this last tour, I thought I would give you a little preview of what the rest of the spring is going to be looking like here on the pod. So, without further ado, let's start off with each chapter by chapter, the takeaways I had for each. So, chapter 1. This was, of course, the adventure of getting to LA and the ride, including some of the elements of the ride, along with the transit fast forwards that got me from LAX Airport, Los Angeles International Airport, to Anaheim, California. And so my chapter 1 takeaway is be prepared for the unexpected. And that came in a couple of different ways. The first was the weather. As you heard when I did chapter 1, well, let's go with expectations here, right? I mean, Southern California, you think beach and sun and warm and everything. And that's true during a very large portion of the year. However, I was going in early March, and early March is not warm. I'm here to tell you. And it was particularly not warm. And as we learned throughout the entire tour, all 4 chapters of it, the weather that came through the area right before my trip really impacted things. What was the big rain event for folks in Southern California that I missed out on, thankfully, behind that was a big cold air mass. And me being a planner that I am, I made sure that I had plenty of warm clothes to make sure that the riding was going to be totally fine. But even still, you can even look at the temperatures and look at the highs. And the highs were in the low to mid 50s Fahrenheit, which is a nice brisk day, but actually reasonably warm, especially if you're coming out of a winter like I was. And the reality is that sometimes that temperature feels colder than it does under other circumstances. When you've got a lot of wind involved as well, which there was massive wind for much of my trip, that really changed things. And in a way, even though it was in the forecast, I should have reasonably expected it. It hit me in an unexpected way. And so I think that one of the things that I often talk about on the podcast is how important it is for you to be flexible, how important it is for you to, maybe you're going to come in with expectations. We always come in with expectations, but we have to be flexible enough to be able to roll with changes in our expectations or deviations from our expectations. So when I'm landing in California and I'm hopping on the bike thinking, well, the forecast says that the rain's going to be over, and I start rolling and there's not only rain, but hail. I mean, you heard it when it was happening. That was such a surprise. And I'm sure it was a surprise to folks in LA too, because that is not a typical thing that they get very often. But with a bike tour, and this was kind of low stakes, let's be perfectly honest here. But when you do get hit with something that's maybe a little bit higher stakes, a freak snowstorm, if you're going through a mountain pass or something along those lines, you've really got to be ready to roll with those changes in your expectations. And a lot of that is just about being prepared. And this gets into the whole dichotomy in bicycle adventuring that I think is always going to be there. It's an ongoing thing. You all know I'm a big planner. As much as I love cycling in some ways, I also like planning for my trips just as much. And as a result, I have a really good sense of what my capabilities are, what's going to be around me at any given point at any given time. And the other school of thought is, hey, part of bicycle touring, bike packing, bicycle adventuring, whatever label you're throwing on what you do, is to be able to just go, and then whatever happens, you deal with it. In both circumstances, I think that the key thing that it aligns both schools of thought is being prepared for the unexpected, being ready to be able to roll with those punches. I think for a planner like myself, I tend to have a good sense of where I'm at any given point. So when that hail hit, I knew that even if that was going to be a thing for the next hour, I knew that I was really, really close to an ostensibly covered area where the metro stop was. So I was just sort of like, okay, this is no big deal. I'm just going to roll through it. If you are the type of person that's more of a, hey, let's go for it kind of a thing, I think when you get hit with something like that, maybe you're not going to know that the metro stop is very, very close by, but you're potentially going to know, oh, okay, that's fine because I've got enough layers on. I know I'm wearing my waterproof stuff. My bike can handle through all sorts of things, even if there's little pellets of ice underneath my tires now. I think that's where we have some commonality there. And, making sure that you've got the right gear for the range of possibilities that you're going to be having. And as long as your range of possibilities, especially for weather and rain and all of that other kind of stuff, covers 95% of what you're going to get, you're going to be fine. You're going to be totally fine. So even if it ends up deviating from that, well, sure, that might be an issue for you mentally, but at least you know that you've got stuff to get you through most of the things that are going to be coming at you. But no matter what, I think you want to be prepared with the gear, but you also want to be prepared mentally for the unexpected, because I know that in other circumstances, deviations, missing a ferry, missing a train, deviation from your planned schedule, that can really throw a lot of people off. And so you've got to be also able to handle the mental preparation. We've got interviews in the past. I've talked about running into mechanicals and how that, of course, is a huge expectation gap. I mean, we never go into any kind of a ride expecting to have any kind of a mechanical. If you do, then, well, I guess you're better than me. I never think about that kind of stuff. But I'm prepared for it. I got my tools. I got my knowledge such that it is to help me through things. The other thing that I want to say about expectations from chapter 1 is your transit expectations. I had very little experience with LA's metro system, particularly with a bicycle. I'd ridden it in, I think the year before, I think it was last year, where I did a little trip that was not bike related. And it was on the Metro Red Line, and had a perfectly lovely experience, and was really kind of impressed by LA Metro's subway system. And subway, and it's above ground in other parts, particularly the part that I just did a few months for this tour. But the one thing that I didn't expect was, sometimes on transit, you end up encountering a unique blend of humanity, including situations that are, well, outside of the normal socially acceptable things. Of course, I ran into a scenario where on this one single train, I had a randomly inebriated dude throw up on the train, which was not fun. And then there was a big fight. I don't even know what kind of a fight it was, but there was a lot going on with that. And of course, that throws things off for you as well. That's uncomfortable. That's not a great space to be in. And for folks that kind of aren't used to being in cities and aren't used to being on mass transit and seeing things like that, look, I spent a summer commuting into New York City. I'm prepared for anything now after that experience. But for the most part, that's unusual and it's rare. But, if you're sitting there with your bike and you've got a bunch of your stuff and you feel like you're sticking out, and, that can really take you out of your game a little bit. And so I understand why using transit, especially in places where it's a wild card, you don't know what to expect, that might not be for everybody. For me, I love it because I think it really just opens things up tremendously, especially in urban environments where you're fast forwarding through parts of cities that maybe just don't have great infrastructure or just aren't that interesting to ride through. I certainly could have ridden through that part of LA. And I had before, actually, in prior years, and it's perfectly fine, but it wasn't that interesting, not super interesting. And it would have delayed me getting to Anaheim by at least probably another couple of hours. And frankly, I wanted to have a night. I wanted to be able to enjoy myself in the evening. So I traded in those couple of hours for a little bit faster fast forward with the Metro Rail, and then had a really interesting experience, and it was fine. Your expectations for using transit should be keyed into what you're trying to pull off. We just recently, through the best ofs, experienced my transit deviations in the transit aided ride, and how in Connecticut I almost couldn't continue because the person who was operating the motor coach was like, nope, you are putting your teeny tiny little folding bike on the front rack. You are not going to bring it into this bus. And that really threw me off expectations wise. So what did I do? I tried my best. I got it on there. It worked out. So I think one of the things that you want to do is, again, have a range of possibilities in your head. Have backup plans. Then make sure that your expectations aren't so narrow, not just in transit, but really in any element of bike touring. And that's just going to make for a better ride. So Chapter 1's takeaway: be prepared for the unexpected and make sure that your expectations are in check. That was a great day of riding. I will think of it fondly, I think. Chapter 2, the next adventure. That was, of course, the ride from Anaheim, and a really fun ride and a fun use of, again, transit systems that got me all the way down to San Diego, which was amazing, really, when I think about it. That was the most, I think, robust amount of transit that I had used probably since I was in Southern Oregon and got from the Oregon-California border and went to Medford to fly out. That was a really robust day because that included planes as well. But this was a really fun one. And my takeaway from that day is about Southern California trails and, again, the transit fast forwards and how great they can be. So let me start off with the trails. The one thing that's really amazing in Los Angeles, and I think more broadly in Southern California, is how really robust their trail system is. It's not talked about, I feel like, a lot because it's not balled together as one gigantic system. And it really isn't. I mean, there's no, Great American Rail Trail or West Coast Greenway kind of concept in Southern California. But the reality is that if you're comfortable riding on the roads for a little bit, you're going to have some pretty good infrastructure there. But then all of a sudden, you're going to end up on some of these trails. And things like the San Gabriel River Trail and the Santa Ana River Trail, those were really fantastic. Now, are they super picturesque? Well, for me, I think it was kind of interesting. I mean, as I mentioned before, they're basically big drainage ditches. They handled a lot of water that had come through the system over the past few days prior to that. But I think that they're kind of fun and cool. And boy, did both of those do some heavy lifting for me, going from north to south in both instances on the two different days. So I think in particular here on Chapter 2, so that also led to some of the trails that I was on in and around Oceanside and those areas as well. Really, really great trails. Of course, the trail that I really enjoyed was essentially affiliated with the Marine base as well. There was a road that had been completely retransformed that I think that they used in part for some military equipment, but that it was not open for other motorized vehicle traffic. So it was basically a big bike trail and used for vehicles. And of course, the bike trails was separated out from that. So really awesome spaces. And I think I mentioned this on the pod within that chapter. If you're into road cycling and you really just want to be able to just slam out some miles and then put the hammer down, it's so hard to do in a lot of different places. And of course, that ends up creating conflicts on multi-use trails. We've talked about that a million times on the pod. But that's a great place to do it. So I think if you live in between LA and San Diego and Oceanside and those types of areas, what a great place to do for all of that. The Southern California trails are just A+, really well maintained, really highly used, and they're 12-month trails too. That's the other thing that I think is really great about it. The other thing that I think is a big takeaway from Chapter 2, and it's a common takeaway from many of my tours, is how impressive a transit fast forward can be in terms of moving you through a route. Now, this isn't for everyone. We talked about that in the takeaway from Chapter 1, but here's why I think that it's a really important takeaway and why I'm going to continue to use them. It allows me to piece together parts of rides that I otherwise wouldn't be able to do because of time. I have not in the last few years been able to take off more than a few days at a time for a variety of different reasons. So in order for me to really be able to do a big ride that effectively spanned from Los Angeles all the way down to San Diego, actually beyond that, down all the way to Chula Vista and to the border, I couldn't do that in just by cycling. So transit's really, really important to have as a part of it, because you're not worrying about renting cars and getting rides and all this other stuff. It's just there. The infrastructure's there, and it can handle your bike, whether you're bringing a folding bike like I did, where it could come on board with you, or it's got a rack and you've got a traditional bike like we more typically have in our bicycle adventures. And in Southern California, I mentioned this again, of course, in the chapter. Holy smokes, for $2, you can go from Long Beach, California, all the way down to San Clemente, on one bus. What an amazing thing, an amazing amount of miles that you can cover. Now, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to ride a good chunk of it, and so I did. But the fact that it's not an all or nothing thing, I was able to pick it up where I picked it up. And where was it? It was Newport Beach, fancy schmancy beach town. Yeah, it was so good to be able to say, okay, I want to ride on the Santa Ana Trail. I want to be able to, I ended up having the coffee with my work friend. And then also to get down there. And I had the opportunity. I had the flexibility. If I wanted to stay in Newport Beach, I could have, grabbed a coffee or a sandwich or something like that. But I was like, no, let's keep pushing, And I could have stayed there an extra hour, but the bus was coming. So I was like, boom, I'm here. Let's pack up. Let's go. And it was sort of the seamless kind of amount of movement that was really helpful for me for my trip. And for those of you that aren't into buses, which I get, I think buses are the most flexible and they're the most ubiquitous. You'll find them in all sorts of different communities out there, which is really helpful. And I very rarely these days run into bus systems that don't have the capabilities to include bikes as well, which is so helpful when you are doing any kind of bike adventuring. So I look into that. But of course, you've also got trains as well. And on this trip, it was great because originally I was struggling with trying to make Amtrak work, and there were issues because their service was not as robust because there was some track work that was being done. And it's a good thing that I don't torture you all by taking you along for all of my planning thought processes and all of the time that I spend on that, because I just really struggle with it. I can't tell you how many times I booked and canceled Amtrak Surfliner trains until I discovered the San Diego County, was it the Coaster? Their local regional transit, which just worked out great. And it was actually even better. And the timing of it worked out even better than taking the Amtrak line. So, it all ends up working out when you kind of dive into it. And if you're into transit at all, that's not necessarily all of you, but I know many of you might have that same transit nerdery as well. By the way, follow, what's the kid's name? Miles in Transit on YouTube. He's very funny and he's all into this kind of transit stuff, including the kind of stunts that I pull off from time to time. In any event, transit fast forwards are so great, so important. I'm going to keep doing them. I hope they're interesting for you. And it is definitely hashtag not cheating to do a transit fast forward as far as I'm concerned. All right. So chapter 3. Chapter 3 was the Border Loop. And the Border Loop was just a fun ride. And before I get into the takeaway, I just want to say how great it was to ride the route that I did. Nothing against the Pacific Coast route. The route that is in the book does not go on Coronado. It goes through basically all of the towns on the other side of San Diego Bay, which is fine. And it was fine. It's congested though, and it's a lot of bike lanes. And I had already done a lot of that. And that's why I was really glad that I was able to take the ferry over to Coronado. The ferry itself is fun. And that was really great. But my big takeaway from chapter 3 actually was what happened about midway through down at the border. And the takeaway is the challenge that you have pushing through challenges versus taking dumb risks. And I think that I passed. When I was going down, it's really amazing. Once you get through Chula Vista and Imperial City, or is it Imperial City and Chula Vista? Anyways, those two towns, which are basically the last towns before things get super weirdly rural. Like there's horse farms and just things get really quiet really quickly in a strange way. But as soon as I was getting down there, I was starting to notice the signs. There was roads closed due to flooding. And I thought, well, darn it. And of course, there are other ways to get to different places at the border, and I could have gone to a variety of different places. But I decided, you know what? I'm going to push through. I'm going to challenge myself and see how things go, because I really wanted to end up at the exact same point. I had this vision in my head of taking the exact same picture that I did from 2014 and trying to recreate it because I wanted to be in the same place. That's what I wanted. So I decided to go for it. And I encountered the first of a flooded road, but it wasn't that flooded. It was only a couple of inches of water. And yes, it was moving. And yes, I always hear the turn around, don't drown kind of stuff, but I think that was in a different context, right? So I kept pushing. And then I found the next road, the next time that the road was covered in running water. And this time it was a little more robust. And this time it was sort of like, is this a good idea? And I thought, maybe this is what they meant. I had already gone past the road closure barricades, not barricades, but at least signs, where it was like, the road is officially closed here. And I thought, okay, well, if I go through this, then this is it. Then all I have to do is my one climb up. And I knew that around the bend that the hill was going to start, and surely there's not going to be flooded roads on a hill. Well, as you all know, I didn't quite get to the hill, because around the bend before the hill was another really, really, really flooded road. And this one didn't have moving water, but I couldn't tell how deep it was. And this is what I'm going to come to about the whole concept of pushing through challenges, like I did prior to that, versus taking dumb risks. And I can't tell you how much I really wanted to recreate that picture. I wanted to be in the same spot. I wanted to close the missing link, which I did in the prior chapter, but I kind of wanted to be back there. I just wanted to. It was a real big driving force behind all this. But you know what? That would have been a dumb risk to go through that. It would have been pushing through something where I didn't know what the bottom was. And, that I was also in the middle of nowhere with very few people around, actually nobody around at that point. And, that's just not a great place to be. And so I think that I passed my own test. Pushing through the challenges, I went through the other areas where the roads were flooded, and they were reasonable calculated risks. But that last one was the bridge too far. Well, I could have used a bridge, actually. But you know what I mean? Taking a dumb risk is, well, dumb. And you know what? I ended up kind of making peace with that. I guess that goes back to the be prepared for the unexpected, or being able to roll with the punches. And you know what? It's fine. I'm looking back on it now going, okay, well, now I have a good story to tell about this trip. And it was different from the last one because it's different. And it's a reminder of how crazy the weather was, and how big the tailwinds were on the first day, and how crazy the headwinds were on the second and third day. So anyways, I think that this is a good reminder that you want to push through challenges. You don't want to take dumb risks. That was the takeaway from chapter 3. Chapter 4's takeaway. This, of course, has all to do with gate checking the Brompton. And I thank you for hanging with me on this particular chapter. I wasn't sure how it was going to turn out. And of course, it ended up being longer of an episode than I anticipated. But there was a lot of kind of fun little writing, and I thought the audio was kind of interesting. And although there wasn't as much bicycling in this particular episode, it certainly was a good test of getting yourself and your bike in and around a place where you're bicycle touring. So I thought it might be helpful. And so my big takeaway about gate checking the Brompton, this is something that I have really avoided. I do have a dim recollection that I gate checked my Brompton on one flight, and I don't remember the circumstances behind it. I don't remember if I was forced to, or if I did it in anticipation of being forced to. I think it was the latter, but that one didn't feel like a big test because what I ended up doing was different than what I did on this one. This one, I wanted to do it in a bike touring context where I had the bike and I was planning on doing this, and I booked my flights knowing that this was going to have to happen because, again, quick review, they were on regional jets. Regional jets are absolutely impossible. You cannot bring your Brompton inside. The overhead bins are just simply not big enough. They're not big enough for regular rollerboards either. So that's something that, you have to be prepared for. Now, by the way, you could get an equipment change really quickly on anytime you're flying with a bicycle. And if you're checking your bike, no big deal, right? But if you get an equipment change and you were expecting a 737, which your Brompton can fit into the overhead, and you end up with a regional jet for some reason, you got problems, and you best be ready for it. And that's why I'm really glad that I did this, because a year or two ago when, again, raising the Oregon Coast one where I ended up going through Medford Airport, I specifically chose a flight that was going to Seattle rather than Portland because I could only get a regional jet from Portland, and for reasons I wanted to have the big plane, even though I didn't have the Brompton, because at one point I was thinking of bringing the Brompton. These are details you don't need. Anyways, point being, I wanted to make sure that I could figure out how to get the Brompton on the jet and do it in a safe way and not have my bike be all broken into pieces. And you know what? Success. I think that there are a couple of things that maybe I would do a little bit differently next time if I was planning on it. I think that it also argues that when I'm not planning on gate checking, that I might need to be a little more prepared for it. And the big thing of that was the one thing that got, I'll call it dinged rather than damaged, was the metal brace where the rear reflector is bolted to. That got bent in to the fender, which meant it pinched it in so that the tire was rubbing. It took me 5 seconds to fix. No big deal. And as a result, I was like, oh, that's weird because that's something that normally people don't protect. Now I think what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to bring like maybe a pair of socks or something like that, something to go in between the fender and the tire, and then maybe again between the fender and that metal bracket there. So just 2 socks, nothing real complicated. And then that way, if it does get pinched, there's something there to give it a little bit of a cushion so that it won't bend in. I've looked at some other opportunities, and I talked about the Dimpa bag. There are folks that will actually bring 2 Dimpa bags. And so they'll put the bike into the Dimpa bag. This is the IKEA bag that it fits into. And then a second bag that goes around that. And in between the 2 bags, they'll put clothes or other things like that. And they use that as their gate check or even their checked bag opportunity. So I think that's kind of intriguing. But of course, it would require me to carry more stuff with me in my carry-on, which I tend not to like to do. I tend to be like to be really light with my carry-on stuff because I just prefer not having to carry so much stuff. Because if you're rolling the bike through an airport, and whether it's going in the overhead or you're gate checking, you got your bike. Even though it rolls real nice and it seems like a nothing burger, it is something. You know, it is something that you've got to be concentrating on. So anyways, I got more to think about with all of that. But my big takeaway with all of this is I don't fear gate checking the Brompton anymore. And furthermore, I'm wondering if, at least on Alaska Airlines, I'll tell you what, it was pretty easy. I mean, once I got that orange tag, that bike was waiting for me by the time I got off the plane. So think about it this way. Once you gate check it, you leave it when you board, and then you grab it right after you get off, then there's no more of the having to hoist the thing through the aisle. No worrying about, sneaking it past flight attendants that don't like that you're bringing it on board. No worrying about, oh, is there enough overhead space? Oh, I don't have MVP status, so I'm not going to be able to board as early. All of that stuff kind of just mystically disappears. So I'm wondering if maybe on a future trip with the Brompton that I may look into gate checking again. My next planned trip with the Brompton is actually this summer. It is not a bicycle touring situation, but I may be integrating for one episode of the pod just because there's some cycling adventure that could be coming out of it. So I will not tell you where it is, but that's going to be back on Southwest Airlines. And Southwest has always just been super, super easy, especially when I get the early bird boarding. So I think I'm going to still do the overhead compartment on that. Also, Southwest Airlines, same flight, I never worry about different equipment. It's always going to be a 737. But for Alaska Airlines, after having gone through this whole mileage run and getting MVP status specifically for the fact that I can board early, I'm wondering if gate checking's better. So more on that to be sure. So those are my takeaways from this fabulous trip. I cannot tell you, people kept asking me, oh, how was your vacation? How was your time in California? And I just would gush. This was one of my most fun trips that I've had. And it had the added extra bonus of I got to see a friend that I don't get to see very often. I got fun weather, if not great weather. I got new to me biking, old to me biking that I really liked. I got a night at the area around Disneyland, which is always fun for me. It was fun. I had a great time and I hope that came across and I hope you guys enjoyed it too. All right, so those are the takeaways. And now for a couple of minutes here, I wanted to give you a bit of a preview on the Pedal Shift project in the spring of 2023. It is going to be jam-packed. Starting next week, we have, returning to the pod, an interview. I know I haven't done an interview and it feels like forever. I haven't been motivated, I'll have to be honest. For whatever reason, interviewing just wasn't feeling it. I have done it, a few interviews for my work podcast that I do for the day job, and that got me going, maybe I should do something about this. And then the world gave me something wonderful. The YouTube algorithm said, hey, Tim, meet Regina Yan. I have a great interview with her because I got to see, as I'll talk about next week in the podcast, I saw her video on YouTube. She is just fantastic. It was a great interview. She's a board member of the Greenway Alliance and did an amazing through ride of a coastal route that I have been putting off way too long. So this is going to be a fun interview with a cool person talking about a route that I have not done yet. So stay tuned next week for that. The following week will be May's best of podcast. I have not chosen it yet. I need to do that, but it'll be good because it's a best of. By definition, it's good. And then the week following, folks, did you think I was going to go this long without doing another bike tour? Well, you are wrong. It is the mid-spring tour for 2023. We'll be following the best of. We'll be kicking it all off. Weather is getting awfully nice around here in the mid-Atlantic. And after taking a year off, it is high time I did another through ride of the C&O. And you will come along for the ride starting that week. We're going to be doing day 0, which is basically getting me to the trailhead. We'll also do the ride preview, probably not in that order. We'll probably do the ride preview first and then the day 0, but you get what I mean. That's going to get us all the way through the spring. So lots of fun episodes, great times, great interview, fantastic best of, by definition, it's great. And the mid-spring tour for 2023. Really excited to share it all with you starting next week with the interview with Regina. And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedal Shift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedal Shift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community, expanding into live shows and covering new tours. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one-shot and annual options. If you're not into the small monthly thing, check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lean, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittus, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadis, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Drew Porter, Byron Patterson, Joachim Robber, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Hankel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Aviles Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Jody Zeranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Biggle, Greg Middlemiss, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latoile Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Ronald Paroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBlanc, Ari Messenger, David Kropke, Todd Grossbeck, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Lico, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCullough, John Hickman, Carl Presso, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, Michael Azuski, Hank O'Donnell, David Zanoni, David Weil, Matthew Sponsella, Chad Reno, Spartan Dale, Carolyn Ferguson, Peggy Littlefield, Lauren Allensmith, Eric Burns, Thomas Pearl, Darren McKibben, Richard Stewart, Dave Fletcher, Jack Smith, Luke Parkinson, Ryan Patterson, Sarus Faravar, John Gardner, Sam Scruggs, Dwight Pintinger, and Connie Bowder. And thanks also to all new and anonymous folks for helping make this show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedal Shift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedal Shift Project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.